Hello everyone, François here. I'm an engineering manager who focuses mostly on the front end ecosystem and on software platforms. This is part 5. Yeah, 5. This was supposed to be like a 2-part series, but I'm really bad at keeping videos short. There's just so much to talk about. But anyway, it's part 5 of a series where we're looking at the front end ecosystem and its evolution over the last 5 years to see how much truth there is to the memes around how chaotic it is and how fast paced the changes come. Is it true that as front end developers, we have to keep chasing the latest and greatest all the time at the cost of providing values for our customers? For those just joining us, to make sure that we're not looking at it with rose tinted glasses, I'm doing a bit of a retrospective on a blog post that I wrote 5 years ago about the topic. And we're going top to bottom. And in this video, we're doing the last two topics. The first one is going to be state management, application lifecycle. And the next, one of the biggest one, component libraries or just frameworks in general. Now, an obligatory warning, we're covering a lot of technology as part of this series. I can't be an expert on everything. I try to do my due diligence and making sure I'm somewhat up to date before talking about this, but if I make any mistakes, which is very likely, please just comment below and let me know. And on that note, let's get going. So, state management or application lifecycle. One thing to remember in 2016 is that folks had gotten burnt over and over by libraries, by JavaScript libraries that promised to make things easier, but that always had the same issue with state management. For example, you had Backbone, which was quite nice at the time, but it made it really difficult to keep your data in a row. You often had to debug memory leaks or had dangling objects that you had to clean up when the components were unmounted, and you could spend hours or days trying to figure out why your application's memory footprint kept growing. And on the other hand, you had Angular, which I thought was really nice, but if your application wasn't really simple, and it had a pretty complex component tree, eventually you ended up in situations where modifying a property would not be reflected in the UI the way you'd expect it to. And you had to start debugging where all your object references were being passed so that you could find a tiny little innocent mistake you made that broke everything. Now, when React came along, with it, Facebook published their an internal architecture, Flux, that they had used successfully with it. And Flux was really nice. It was very much like propagating data top down in your component tree, and you had a much more predictable flow of data. However, it was kind of heavy, it was boilerplate heavy. So, very quickly, the community went along with their own takes on it. And for a while, there was very much a new Flux framework every day coming along. And that was not great. There was a lot of fragmentation in the community. So then Dan Abramov and Andrew Clark came along with a tiny little library that was originally made for a tech demo to show off time travel debugging, which you might be familiar with at this point. And that library was Redux. What was nice about Redux is it was kind of a little bit like Flux, but it represented your state management as a stateless function, a reducer function. There was a top level state that was kind of atomic and used across your entire application. And that solved a lot of problems. What was nice with Redux was that no matter how small or how big the problem you were trying to solve, the pattern you'd use was always the same. You get the state, you modify the state, you have a new state. And you just have to do that over and over and over and over. And that will basically build your entire application, which was great, very predictable, very few things to learn. Redux, though, had two issues. The first one was that it was really verbose. And while folks that came with maybe a Java background or C sharp background didn't feel like it was that bad, though some did, the front end community is extremely diverse. And for some people, that was completely unacceptable. Software engineers don't like doing the same thing over and over, they want to be more creative when they develop. And that led to the second problem, which is that the community built abstractions, tools, and framework on top of Redux, using Redux as more of a low level component for these higher level tools. And that created that fragmentation that Redux had momentarily solved with the Flux world. To make matter worse, it was the trendy library that everybody was using. That means a lot of engineers got forced to use it, even if maybe that was not what they wanted, maybe it was not the best way to solve the problems they were trying to solve. But generally, when software engineers use tools they don't want to use, they get really unhappy. And so Redux started getting a bad reputation. Alternatives like MobX really picked up, and for a while I even thought that they'd become the norm, even though I much prefer Redux. Others pushed that you didn't need such a library at all, and that the React built in set state was more than enough. I really didn't agree with that because most of the examples of application built with just React set state, at least with what was available at the time before a proper context API and hooks, it, large applications made that way were really hard to maintain and wrap your head around, and most of the successful ones were much simpler or smaller. So, how are things in 2021? Well, we touched on that in previous videos, but now you have GraphQL and the frameworks like Apollo and Relay built around it. And since most state management is about managing data that you get from the server, these frameworks kind of handle all of that. And if your application is heavily data driven, that might be sufficient. There's also some newer frameworks with the benefit of hindsight, like Recoil, that are pretty elegant to handle state management. And on top of all that, Mark Erickson and the rest of the Redux crew have been doing a lot of work with the community to kind of put together all the best ideas and put some more first party abstractions that they call the Redux Toolkit. React is also not the only kid on the block, and you have Vue.js with Vuex. And one thing that the Vue community did really well is having a quote unquote approved state management framework, Vuex, that's documented on the same website than Vue. It allowed their community to agree on a way to do things and prevent that fragmentation. And I think the fragmentation is the biggest problem the React world has. It doesn't really matter which framework you use. What you don't want is to have everybody use doing it a different way. So, what's the verdict? While it got a bad rap, Redux really got the job done, and pretty much everywhere I go, companies adopted it and used it and built really successful software with it. So we can't say it didn't work. Yeah, there's boilerplate, but if you resisted putting all these abstractions to get rid of it, it really provided consistency and reduced the amount of things your engineers had to learn to be successful. There were some of these abstractions that were really good and really leveraged the Redux philosophy, like Immer, which kind of allowed you to get your cake and eat it too. Less boilerplate, but things are still really predictable and easy to follow. And these days, the Redux toolkit is really great. So I wouldn't feel bad about using Redux. Actually, I think it's a pretty good idea if today you adopted it. But you do have these newer options that have the benefit of hindsight. And again, if you are using GraphQL, you can just leverage your GraphQL framework like Apollo and kind of be done with it. But really, Redux is still great. I'd say the biggest pain point with Redux is having to fight people who say you should abandon Redux. There's nothing bad from a technical point of view with it. And finally, the last topic, the core libraries, or really the component libraries. This is probably one of the most important choices you'll make because it will dictate what are your options for every other categories. So in 2016, the ecosystem had gone through a lot of large jumps. You went from vanilla jQuery applications, then to lightweight frameworks like Backbone, going to these monolithic do it all libraries like Angular, and eventually React came along. It was advertised as just being the view layer, even though it could do a lot more than that, because it didn't have all the toolings, like it didn't come, let's say, with a router. And many people thought that was a step back. On top of that, it had this JSX syntax, which was and still is completely optional, and it required a compiler. And for a lot of folks, it was a deal breaker because not everybody used a compiler toolchain to build front end apps back in the days. What React brought to the table, though, was a new way to think about how you build your application. Instead of having to write code that manipulates at the low level, how to, like, in templates, manipulate at the low level how your elements are created, deleted, and like doing all this kind of micromanagement, you just wrote your UX, your UI declaratively, describe what it should look like given a certain state, and everything just happened like magic. It reduced an entire category of bugs. At the time, I read an article that mentioned how adopting React wasn't a technology decision, it was very much a business decision since it made your teams so much more efficient. And again, by removing an entire category of bugs, it directly impacted your customers. So naturally, with all that, I heavily recommended React at the time. So what about today? How are things looking? Well, as with a lot of the other topics that we touched on, uh, the ecosystem is similar but more mature. React is still absolutely awesome, but we now have a bunch of other equally awesome alternative. Vue.js is often put forward as a slightly more newcomer friendly alternative, which has great documentation, it's known for it, and much less ecosystem fragmentation. And Angular 2, even though it's sometimes dragged down by the bad rep that Angular 1 got near the end of its lifespan, is still an absolutely solid option. Maybe not used as much, but those who do are absolutely successful with it. What I find interesting about Vue.js is if you look at GitHub stars, which are not a proxy for quality, and you shouldn't pick a framework like that. But if you look at the history, React was really dominating for a while, and it was almost the only thing people considered. And now Vue.js catched up and even surpassed it. It does mean that the community has faith in multiple extremely solid frameworks. So whatever you pick, you're going to be in a really good shape. Web components are also still a thing. They're kind of clunky to use. The API was designed a long time ago when things were pretty different, and I think that held back their adoption. The idea of having a component framework built straight natively in the platform is still awesome. And more you're seeing the higher level framework have options to convert their components into web components that you can then use with any framework. So, what's the verdict? Well, in 2016, React was absolutely the right decision, and if you picked it then, it really served you well over the next couple of years. And if you want to keep using it, or if you're building a new app from scratch and you want to use React, it will definitely still be a good choice for the next couple of years. But now you do have the solid alternative like Vue.js. Really just don't use multiple ones. Like if you are using React, there's no good reason or at least no good business case to switch. And having multiple of these component libraries mean you'll need multiple of every libraries or almost. And worse, you might need multiple implementation of your design system. I see especially large companies do that, and it's just shame that they double or triple or quadruple their effort for very little gain, often just for somebody's personal preferences. Just don't do that. Still, it's really awesome to be in a world where there's multiple slam dunk tools like this. All right, we finished going through all the topics of the blog post. So, what about you? Did you use something else than React over the last couple of years? And were you successful doing so? So, with all of that behind us, there's one more video to make. In the next one, I'm going to go quickly over everything we talked about and tally the score so that we can finally answer the big question. Is the front-end ecosystem really as crazy and chaotic as people say it is? Did it really change that much over the last couple of years? So with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.